How you doing? I'm Jordan Lawson. I'm a research software engineer with the Computational Biology Core, which is part of CCV, the Center for Computation and Visualization, which is subsumed under OIT, I believe. So it's kind of a hierarchy there. And I'll just be giving a presentation today on GitHub Actions, pretty much just the basics of kind of setting up a GitHub action, how to define the workflow, the different pieces, walking through the terminology, what actions are, what are the different components, and then we'll be kind of walking through some real world examples. I have two repos specifically that we'll be looking at today that we'll walk through and kind of just dissect the different pieces, what goes into these workflows and what makes them run. So I'll share my slides. Actually, before I do that, let me just share. I did create a public repository that you all should be able to access. This actually comes from a real world example where we use GitHub Actions for setting up our analysis repositories in the computational biology core. So actually give you all the link to that. And please feel free to interrupt me at any point to ask questions. I put the link to the repo in the chat. So if you want to kind of just access that repo and follow along, look at the code in there, or start your own blank slate repository and borrow code from there, use that as a template to kind of build out your own GitHub action, feel free to do so. Also, feel free to interrupt me as I go along if you have any questions. Let me share my slides so you can see. And you all can you can see my slides, correct?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Let me actually turn them. Yeah, so just a DSCoV workshop on GitHub Actions and action. I couldn't help myself. I had to do a little play on words there. But yeah, this would just be a really introductory walkthrough of GitHub Actions. And so I'll give an intro of where we're kind of coming from here in giving this talk. So, I mean, pretty much the aim of this is we're going to explore GitHub Actions, what they are, their use cases, right? So why they're used, why they're useful, and then how to use them. I am assuming some familiarity with Git and GitHub. So for example, I assume that people know what a GitHub repository is, how to add, commit, and push changes to a repository, both using the web interface and the command line interface. But also feel free to stop me if something is unclear or there is something about Git or GitHub that isn't known to you. I don't mind covering Git and GitHub Actions, but it does kind of assume that knowledge, if that's okay. I mean, specifically, not only will we talk about what GitHub Actions are, why you want to use them, and how to use them, but we'll go through kind of how to write and run your own GitHub action. That, again, it comes from a real world example. So I actually borrowed from a GitHub repository that has GitHub Actions set up on it for conducting analyses in the computational biology core using what's known as a Docker container, pretty much a lightweight virtual machine, an isolated environment that has everything you need in it to run something like a specific analysis. For like the analysis of biological data. So that image might need to get updated. So there's kind of like a new software release or new image releases. So we want to continuously do that. And so we use GitHub Actions for that. And so we'll be borrowing from that example and walking through that to kind of explore what GitHub Actions are. Any questions before we start or dive in a little bit more? No? Okay. So I'm assuming that you're fairly unfamiliar with GitHub Actions. So what is GitHub Actions? It took me a while to figure out what this was too, at least at a bit of a deeper level. But GitHub Actions is pretty much just a platform, right? A continuous integration and continuous delivery platform. We'll talk about that a little bit more. That allows you to pretty much automate the building, testing, and deployment of software, right? So, this could be an app. a web application. This could be something that I just mentioned, a container, a Docker container, that, isolated environment that has all the software and dependencies you need to run a specific task, right? Yeah, you could deploy a web page using GitHub Actions, right? And you can do it continuously in a way that's automated. So it's really useful for developers. And that was essentially the aim of GitHub Actions when it was launched, right? It was launched in 2018, pretty much just to help developers automate their workflows. Right. And so now automation is kind of becoming a big thing. You don't want to over automate. I have a problem with doing that sometimes. You want to thoughtfully automate, but it's becoming a big thing because it's really useful, right? And it can help reduce human error. So GitHub Actions essentially helps you achieve that goal. So some key features that I really just want to introduce about GitHub Actions is importantly, it integrates very nicely, very seamlessly with GitHub itself. Right. That's important because, and we'll talk about this again, but we're using GitHub, right? Or at least we should be using GitHub, especially on projects that involve collaboration, and you have so many people contributing to something and you want to track, okay, all these changes that are getting made, all these updates, are there any conflicts between, two different pieces that are going to be integrated and merged together to form that final whole, that production code, right? You want to catch that and spot that before it goes into production and creates a bug or flaw or an error, right? So GitHub's really useful for that. So you're probably already using GitHub often, and GitHub Actions is nice because it just adds to that, right? It integrates really nicely with that. And so on top of all of that GitHub offers, you can build, test, and deploy code right from GitHub on top of that, right? So it's really nice. And the main idea is that you have a GitHub repository, and that's where you're going to set up your GitHub Actions, right? And basically events, what's known as events on the repository, trigger these workflows, right, automatically. And once these workflows are triggered, they perform these specific tasks. And so, this is essentially called event-driven triggers. So you have this workflow that automatically handles these things for you, these specific tasks that you want to happen, and you specify them. But they only happen when a certain event actually occurs, and you define that event, and we'll see that later on. All right. And that's essentially what that third bullet point down there describes, what I already went through. But they're just triggers, again, or just specified events that occur on a repository. And they really can range from, creating pull requests to pushing commits to a whole host of other things. So there's a lot of flexibility and customization in GitHub Actions. And so we'll talk about that. But just some popular use cases. So like, what can it do? Oftentimes, what are we using GitHub Actions for, right? And the main reason GitHub Actions is so useful is that, again, it can be used for automating a wide range of tasks, and that's really nice. So just some examples to give you ideas. Deploying to Amazon Web Services, AWS, right? You can deploy a web application, a container that, runs some application or runs some analyses and stores the data somewhere. You can automatically update that and deploy that to just about any hosting platform, right? Any hosting service, from AWS to Google Cloud Platform to a range of other things, right? You can also use GitHub Actions, and many people do, for emailing developers or teammates about code updates, or if any code fails any tests, right? That can be really important because in continuous integration, right, you're going to be, hence the name, continuously integrating kind of new code, right? Updated code into all the other code you have, right? When you want to code and introduce updates, you want to make sure that passes a series of tests first and is working as intended before it gets merged with the production code. GitHub Actions can and is often used for exactly that purpose, for automatically running those tests when new code is pushed to a repo. And then, based on the results of those tests, it can then say, hey, okay, do a merge. It can alert you to, merge it to the main branch, that final production code repository, or it can say, hey, this code isn't working as intended. There's something wrong with it. It failed the test. And it can automatically send out emails or even Slack messages. I think even text messages. Yeah, you can get pretty fancy with GitHub Actions, but I don't really see text messages happening too often. I wouldn't probably do that. It can be used for scheduling and running background jobs. I've used it for that. So cron jobs. So for example, we have a website for the computational biology core, our team, that kind of highlights, it has cards on it, right? And these cards highlight all the different projects that are ongoing within the core or that may have been completed by the core. And so it gives information about these, these analyses, these projects, who performed them, et cetera. And so when, new information, new projects are done or come into the core and we upload them onto a GitHub repository, we have a cron job, right? A scheduled job running, every night at midnight that scans for new information and then, identifies that new information, updates the website, and then launches a new updated website with that new project information, detailing kind of, the new projects that came in, who's the lead on that project, the tools used, any associated websites, et cetera. So those scheduled jobs, they can be really useful and they can be handled by GitHub Actions as well. Really two really common overarching use cases for GitHub is continuous integration. And essentially, this is just testing and building code before merging it with other code, right? To create that kind of final production level code. You're constantly integrating these changes, these code updates. And before you do, you want to test that code and make sure it works. You don't want to just merge it into, your final code. Say you weren't working with GitHub and GitHub Actions and, you had a whole bunch of people collaborating on a project. And there was some code, some production code that you knew was working in one stage or one form. And then somebody, you don't know who, made a change. They integrated some new code into that production ready code. And with good intentions, right? They thought it worked and it didn't. And now everything broke, right? The code wasn't tested beforehand. We don't know who pushed the changes, what changes were made. GitHub Actions are really, nice for dealing exactly with that scenario, right? Helping to prevent that. Also, continuous deployment. Sorry, I just got a typo. So you can automatically release new production code and software to users, and that's really nice too because it automates the process such that it reduces manual labor overhead, right? So you have a new version of software that you want to release or a new version of a web application specifically that you want to release. GitHub Actions can automatically do that, right? It can test the code, build the app for you, so you can preview it and you say, okay, this looks right. You hit okay, and then it can release that into production. So I think that's really nice as well. So continuous integration and continuous deployment are pretty much the two really big use cases for GitHub Actions. And then just covering, the benefits, why use it. I'm sure you pretty much already sold, but again, it's just going to save you time and effort, and it's going to help reduce human error, right, through that automation. Also, something important to note is there's a good deal of like customization that's possible. So it's pretty customizable, which is really, really nice because now you can develop workflows to meet like your really specific needs, right? So you can create your own actions, and we'll discuss a little bit more what actions are, or you can use pre-built actions from GitHub Marketplace to really kind of tailor your workflow to whatever task or project that you're tackling. Again, integration, I did mention this briefly, but it really works seamlessly with GitHub and its array of features. So you're very likely already using GitHub in Git. And so, I imagine you're using that, but you haven't really dived into GitHub Actions. And so this integrates and plays really, really nicely with GitHub. And so now you can get collaboration, version control, and automation, right? And then also there's a large active group of users that contribute to GitHub Actions. And that's important because this makes it so that there's a whole bunch of pre-built actions available for your own use. And also you can build your own actions and share this with others. That's a little more advanced. I won't be going through that in this presentation, a little beyond the scope, but we can talk about it a little bit if you want. You can think of it almost like, I'm sure you all code a little bit, so you're familiar with R, Python. It's almost like building, your own package or your own library. You can build your own actions and then, make them open source and share them with others. And then many others in the GitHub community, they have these open source actions, just a publicly accessible repo essentially with code on it that you can pull or import into your workflow. And so you can do a whole host of different things that you need to do to complete any specific task. So that's really useful. So before we dive into kind of like a workflow, developing it, what are the pieces that go into it, and looking at some GitHub actions on some repos. It's important just to understand GitHub actions, the terminology, the different pieces. So the whole purpose of GitHub actions really is to automate workflows. So it's important that we talk about workflows. And every workflow consists of several core concepts. So you're pretty much going to see these as reoccurring pieces across, all workflows. So the workflow in and of itself is just that automated process, right? That's going to be made up of one job or several jobs. Usually it's several jobs. I mean, you can have a workflow made up of one job, but it's made up of several jobs that get carried out when it's triggered by what's called an event, right? So there's going to be some triggering event that's going to kick off the workflow, and then automatically it's going to carry out several jobs that you've defined as the user, right? These events, they're defined triggers. You define these as well, right? So you say, okay, I want the workflow to happen when this happens. And after that when is essentially the event, right? And this defined trigger starts the workflow. And just as some examples, this can include, creating a branch, opening a pull request, even things such as like commenting on an issue or changing a specific file within a repo. So it doesn't have to be like this big grand action, right? It can be like just one little edit to a specific individual file in a certain place on a repo that can trigger an event. In fact, our real world example today, that's exactly what happens, right? There's one individual file. If any edits occur to that file, it triggers a whole entire workflow and something gets updated. So I think that's pretty cool. So in addition to workflow events, we have jobs, right? And these are the tasks that are executed inside of the workflow after an event has triggered the workflow, right? And so you'll see these pieces coming up often. And then actions. So actually for a while got actions confused with workflow, but there is a distinction to be made there. So an action is a custom application for the GitHub Actions platform that it performs tasks, but they're usually complex tasks, right? So that's why they made this custom application. And you're importing it into your workflow. And this can either be, a pre-built open source action available in the GitHub marketplace, or you can create your own private action or your own open source action that you've shared with the community. Either way, you're importing it into your workflow, so you don't need to explicitly define all the steps and write all the code. It's kind of importing, a library into R, sort of like that. You think of it in that manner, or using the import statement in Python. And then lastly, what you're going to hear about is runners. I like to think of runners as machines. You can just think like virtual machine that executes the jobs in your GitHub Actions workflow. So tying it all together, pretty much, GitHub Actions is just this platform that uses these workflows, right? And these workflows are these automated processes comprised of all those pieces we just discussed: jobs, events, actions, and runners. And so just to tease that apart, the events start the workflow, right? They trigger it. The jobs are the tasks that are inside of the workflow. They're the steps that get executed, and you'll actually see that in what's called a YAML file. Actions are, they're kind of like, jobs, but they're these custom applications that are for complex tasks. So they say, hey, do this complex job, and there's already some pre-built directions or instructions for doing so, right? So they get imported into the workflow alongside jobs, right? There's information about what steps to run inside that workflow, and all of this gets executed on a machine or a server known as a runner, right? So that's important. And there's different types of runners or machines that's available to GitHub Actions. That'll depend on, which operating system you want to use. Just to tease that apart a little bit more. Usually, in my experience, I'm using Linux, but that's not the only operating system available to you. You can use a runner with Windows, other operating systems, other variants of certain operating systems, Ubuntu, etc. Just note that something important to mention is GitHub Actions is free, especially for public repositories, but there's limits on the resources. And those limitations are tied to actually the type of runner you use as well. I won't get into all the details there, but I think for a free version of GitHub Actions, it still comes with like a good amount of resources. I think it's 500 megabytes of memory and I think 2,000 minutes of running time and per month. And so you can think of that as just how many minutes your actions or your workflows, the tasks inside of that workflow, how long did they take to run? Right. And so you get so many runs of those tasks inside your workflow per month, right? Depending on how many minutes each of those tasks take. You actually get a different amount of minutes though, depending on which runner you use. So I think the 2,000 minutes per month is based on a runner using Linux. If you use Windows or Mac OS, operating systems with your runner, I think you actually get less resources, specifically less minutes per month. And I can look into that more. But so it's just important to know, what you're specifying as a runner, what operating system you're using, because that can have implications for, the workflow you write, but also your resources. So now that we talked about GitHub Actions and the pieces that go into GitHub Actions and what it is and why it's useful, let's actually get started with setting up GitHub Actions. So we're just going to walk through kind of some basics of setting up a workflow, getting that started, and then hopefully we can run one today and see the live logs and just go through everything and see what it's about. So to actually set up a GitHub action, I'm sure you already have a GitHub account. If you don't, create one, but I'm sure you all do. And then what you want to do is you either want to use an extant repository that you think a GitHub Actions workflow would be useful for, or create a new repository where you want to create your workflow. In the chat, I actually shared a repository that I have a GitHub Action workflow set up on that we're going to walk through today. So if you want to visit that, that'd be great. If you want to create your own repository and build your own workflow from scratch, drawing from that workflow in that repo I shared, feel free to do that as well. So once you have that GitHub account and repository set up, what you need to do is you need to create your workflow by first creating a directory called .github /workflows, right? So it needs to have this prefix here. It needs to have that .github there. And just a quick example, and if you go to the link that I put in the slide, you'll actually see this. What we have here is, this is the piece where we set up the workflows. You can pretty much for now ignore the rest. Your repo is going to have whatever you need in that repo, right, for whatever project you're setting it up for. But the key component is that .github /workflows. That directory needs to be present for you to have any GitHub Actions workflow that works at all. If you don't, then your workflow won't work. Once you created that, then pretty much the important piece comes into play, right? So you set up that directory, and then everything really happens in what's called a .yaml file. I'm assuming some familiarity with this, but we can go through that if need be. But you define your GitHub action in this YAML file, and you can call it whatever you like, as long as it ends with the extension .yaml, YAML, or YML. And this file is really the cornerstone of everything. It's super important because this is what defines your workflow configuration. This is where you're going to explicitly type out everything about your GitHub Actions workflow, how you want it to operate, the jobs and the tasks you want it to perform, etc. And then what's really important is you have to store this .yaml workflow file in the directory you just created on that repository for things to work. So actually, let me just share my screen for a bit and go to the directory. So here's the repository that I shared in the chat if you all want to visit this. I pretty much borrowed this from a real world example, but kind of tweaked it a little bit for the DSCoV workshop today. But you'll see, we have our README, and this kind of just details everything about the repo. There are some important things we're also going to walk through today. We're going to talk about using secrets, setting those up to incorporate those with your workflow to kind of hide important information, so you can make it available to the workflow, but not any outside prying eyes. Right. But you see in this repo, and if you're starting your repo from scratch, you just create this directory here. It's .github/workflows. And then in here, I have a YAML file called repo_docker.yaml. And this is the meat and potatoes. This is pretty much how you get started with GitHub Actions. You need to go in there and specify your workflow. And I'm going to return back to the slides just to kind of give a general overview of how to build out this YAML file, and then I'll go back to this example. Actually, probably just share my whole desktop. Are there any questions so far, or anything that's unclear, or anything that I'm assuming familiarity with, but somebody may not have familiarity with? Okay. And so we'll have this .yaml file. You can call it whatever you like, and that DSCoV example repo is just docker.yaml. The typical structure for a GitHub Actions workflow.yaml is pretty much what you're looking at here. This is a really, really simple, basic starting point. You can obviously build things out. Things will repeat. You'll see that in the examples we return to shortly, but just as a really basic starting point, you're going to have this YAML file with key value pairs, right? So you're going to have, a key, a name of something for that key, colon, and then it's going to be paired with some information that goes with it, right? So what you first start with is name, and that's going to be, the name of the workflow. Give it any name that you like that's informative. It's really important because this information is what you're going to see in the live logs. So something about GitHub Actions is when you run them, when you specify this workflow.yaml file, and then your workflow is triggered by an event, and so some automated process starts. As it's running, you can actually, on the repo, and I'll show you shortly, you can go to actions and it'll show you currently running actions. And if you click on that, you can actually go to a screen that's going to show you the logs in real time as the action is running. And it's going to spit out information in accordance with what's in this workflow.yaml file. So it'll tell you, okay, this is the name of the workflow that's being ran, the code down here, which we'll go through. This is what's being run. And then you'll get any information, including error information, there in your live log. You can spit that error information out to like a certain directory or storage point. We can discuss that later, but I mean, a nice starting point is, you specify your YAML and you actually get a live log there stored right on the repo that you can inspect for troubleshooting and information purposes. So the first piece is just name of the workflow. You'll see that spit out in the live logs. This piece is important. It's the on piece, right? And so this is where you start to define your triggering event, right? What do you want to trigger your workflow? So it's going to be on, and then you're going to indent, and then you're going to define an action here. And then under this action, there's going to be additional information that helps kind of clarify how that action triggers the workflow. And you're going to see what I mean more specifically soon. So you might see on, and then the action might be like push, right? So when someone pushes a commit to a GitHub repository, right? So it might be, again, it's going to be the key, then colon, right? So it's going to be on, then push, colon, and then where is that push occurring? Is it going to occur on the main branch? Is it going to occur on, a dev branch, a branch you specifically set up for development, et cetera? This is where you kind of start specifying exactly your event that triggers the workflow, right? Does that make sense? Or are there any questions? You could do on like pull request or anything else. And then the additional information here will be like, the branch, main or dev. It could be a path. So not just on like the main branch, but then if we're editing a specific file and you want that to trigger the workflow, then it might be something like on, push, And then here would be like main, right? So when somebody pushes the main, and then it might be a specific, specific file. So it could be like name of file and path where that file can be found. And so you start kind of building that out. I think of it kind of like a tree, right? Like a tree of information just being built out. And then below that, another key piece that you're going to see in all workflows, besides name and then on, which is that triggering event, is jobs. So this is essentially, what do you want to happen in your GitHub actions once a triggering event has occurred, right? So it starts with this key here, jobs colon. And then this is your runner information. So what we discussed before, kind of like your server, your machine that's running a job. And note that you can actually run jobs in parallel. So you don't have to run them serially or sequentially. You can run jobs in parallel. So, a workflow might have 3 different jobs and you can run them all in parallel if it makes sense to do so. But this is your runner information. So it's always runs -on colon. And then this is, the OS, the system that you want your runner to work with, right? That is running jobs on. Usually I put Ubuntu Linux. So I'm using Linux as my operating system for my runner. And then after you specify, your runner information, what happens next is the steps, right? So these are essentially just your jobs, your tasks where, you communicate to GitHub Actions, what do I want to be performed? And also in communicating what you want to be performed, what actions do I want to be called into or imported into my workflow that can help me perform these jobs or tasks, right? And then after steps, you start with your jobs. You start kind of like delineating your jobs, just listing these out. And so this can get a little varied. So I'm going to show you some actual real world examples of exactly how this looks. But, you give your job a name. There's a lot of different options you can go with. I'm going to send a resource through the chat. I didn't want to overwhelm everybody. We only have 45 minutes. There's a lot of, different keys and pieces you can use. You can even, assign a job, not just a name, but an ID variable, right? And call it, whatever you like. And that's important because then you can reference that job in another job, right? By using that ID. So, if you want to pass the output, from one job to another, or you want to leverage something from one job in another, you can actually specify this ID variable in one job and then call it using that ID variable in another job. So each job is given a name. The ID piece is optional, but you can get into that for reasons I just discussed. There's additional keys or options you can use called uses. So if you want to import an action, so if you want one of your jobs to use a specific pre-built open source action, then you'll use this uses key. And then after this uses key will be the name of the GitHub action that you want to import in. It can be somebody else's or even your own, right? And then a lot of times, you look up the documentation for these GitHub actions. You definitely want to, because they require certain arguments for these actions. So then you'll specify, if you are using this uses key, then you'll also use the with key. So with colon, and then you list out the arguments that are used by the action. And then on top of that, you don't have to just use pre-built open source GitHub actions, but a lot of times what you'll see is, I'll have another job, my job 2. And then you don't have to use an action or some pre-built application that kind of is already defined for you and performs these tasks. You can actually write code right within the GitHub action itself for performing a series of steps that you want it to, right? And so that's also why it's important to remember, or be aware of the operating system you're working with, the runner that you specified. So, if I'm using Linux, then essentially it's just bash code, right? So then you can just type run : and you can make it one line, right? So, you can do like CD, I don't know, some root directory, go to here, and then it'll run that line of code within your runner and perform that step, that specific instruction. Oftentimes what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to, within one job, so within my job 2, within the name of this job here, I want to run a whole bunch of code, a whole bunch of steps then you'll start with this pipe operator, which will just tell GitHub Actions to run multiple lines of code. And then you can specify all the code you want here. Just keep it in mind that how you write your code is dependent on the operating system you chose for your runner, right? I'm almost always using Linux. So I'm writing, I'm basically doing shell script, right? So it might be CD here, then, make directory here and do a whole bunch of steps. And so then it'll on that runner run this code line by line. And that's essentially the basics of GitHub Actions. And this will repeat, right? So you'll probably have multiple jobs. So you have this first job, this second job, and you can keep going, right? Name and the name of your third job. And then if you want to use an already pre-built action, it uses the name of that action. Or if you want to use your own custom, instructions or code, you type run : right? That run key. And then you type in, your shell script or your bash code or whatever. Let's actually look at a GitHub Actions workflow and go through it. So you all can actually see this in a more real world example. So we're going to just walk through this repo here, which I shared with everybody. I'm going to go back to the screen. So now that we kind of understand the different pieces of GitHub Actions, the basic setup of a YAML file that defines your workflow, let's actually look at a real world example. So you can see, similar to the slide, it has those pieces, right? Name, on, jobs, right? Those are kind of like the three critical pieces you're going to see across the majority of GitHub Actions workflows within your YAML file, right? So just knowing those three kind of main pieces will get you most of the way there for pretty much anything you tackle. And so the name, I just call this, pushing updated image CI, that's continuous integration. This image is just an image for a Docker container. So just to give a little context, what we're doing here is we have an analysis repo, and this repo is for a specific project analysis. So we might be analyzing some biological data. We can keep it really simple and say, okay, say we have count data, or say we have we'll say normally distributed data, and we want to run some regressions on those data. And so we build a container, right? And in this container, it contains all the software and dependencies needed to run these regressions on these data and spit out the results as output and store them in a folder, right? So we got R, we got any packages in R we need installed. We got everything we need to run our series of regressions on these biological data that we need to perform the regressions on. But say that, across the lifespan of this project, we start tweaking things, we start, getting more information, or there's a newer version of a package that we want to use because it gives better results, or anything changes that's important. And so we want to update this container, this image, right, that we're using for importing the data, performing analyses, these regression analyses on these data, and then storing the results. Instead of doing all this manually, what we can do is rely on GitHub Actions to do this, right? To kind of continuously integrate these changes, right, to this image, to this Docker container, and then deploy or upload and store this container to some centralized repository, right? So that's essentially what this is doing. That's the context behind this whole GitHub Action setup. So the name is just pushing updated image CI. Is there any questions, by the way, or anything that was unclear?
Jordan, can you make the font bigger, please?
Oh, make the font bigger? Sorry. Is that better?
That is better.
Sorry about that. So the name is just pushing. Oh, I'm sorry. Was there another question?
A little bit bigger, Jordan, if you could.
Oh, sorry. Is that better?
Yep, thank you.
No worries. Oh, yeah, somebody slacked me and said zoom in too. I'm sorry. I was getting carried away talking. But But as you can see, this pretty much takes on the same structures we discussed in the slide. The slide was just there for more generality. But yeah, we have the name and then we have on. This is key because this is where you're specifying your event, right? Your triggering event. So when do we want this GitHub Actions workflow to be triggered? When do we want it to start? Well, we want it to happen on a push, right? And so I'm assuming you're all familiar with Git and GitHub. So, say you make a change to a repository, and so like, I'm operating on the command line, and I'm just gonna kind of go through it. So I'm in my, my Git folder, and I'm in one of these folders, and I want to make a change to, one of these repositories. I'm going to do, a Git add, a Git commit, and then a Git push, right? We're going to do those series of steps. And so what I want to have happen is I want this GitHub action workflow to be triggered whenever there's a push. So then under on, I use the push key, right? And I'm going to send you some documentation for kind of all the keys and options that are available to you. It's pretty extensive, so there's definitely no way I could go through all the keys or the options we could go through in this presentation, but I'll make sure to send that website as a resource so you can kind of go through the whole GitHub Actions syntax if whenever you have time. But we're going to do it on a push. So under on, we're going to define our triggering event as push. So we do push : and then we want to specify exactly where we want this to take place. So not just, a push of a commit to the repository, but to which branch, right? And so this will happen on the main branch because, in your GitHub repository, you can have multiple branches. It's often advised that you do so, one for production, one for development, maybe many others that's tied to specific collaborators on the project, so forth. But we're going to have this one set up so that whenever there's a push, a change made to the main branch, it's going to trigger the GitHub action, right? So you can see it kind of trickles down. That's the flow. On, so what's the triggering event? Well, the triggering event is on a push, right? So when you push a commit, well, specifically where? Well, to the main branch, and then specifically where within the main branch, right? Not just the main branch generally. So if we actually took this out, if we took this piece out, and that's why in that slide it says that additional information, because it's kind of that specifying information that helps you narrow down the triggering event to maybe like a specific change in an individual item that triggers the workflow, as opposed to kind of just a change on a branch anywhere, right? You can kind of drill down in these pieces, because if we took this out and we just left on push branches : main, then what would happen is this workflow would get triggered whenever we made a change to the main branch, no matter where it was. So just to go back, just to make it clear, you have your repo here. We're on the main branch. It's the only branch in this case. And so anywhere on this branch, if I changed a file in here, or if I changed a file in scripts or so forth, it would trigger that workflow if I didn't specify this additional piece. So that's why, kind of as discussed in the slides, these additional pieces can be really important for kind of targeting exactly what you want to target. Or if you don't, then you don't use paths, and then you can say, okay, any change to the main branch will trigger this workflow. So it's kind of up to you exactly how you want to set up your workflow and what triggers it, right? And that's what's nice about GitHub Actions, right? That specificity. So after you get that down, what the triggering event is, then you go on to jobs, right? So what are the steps you want to be performed? What are you using to perform those steps or those tasks, right? Are you writing your own code? Or are you using imported actions? And so we'll go through that. So now, just like with the slide shown, you see we have that jobs key. So it's jobs : and then we start drilling down into the specifics, right? What we want to have happen, right? And so I'll skip this update piece. Really what we want to focus on is, just like in the slide before, we have the runs on key, right? That runs on argument. This is your runner. So I'm just using the latest version of Ubuntu, which is just a Linux operating system, right? So I'm using Linux on my runner, on my virtual machine. And then within this runner, right, on this machine, what do I want to have happen, right? So it falls right under runs on. And then we're going to lay out the steps. So I have multiple steps, right? You can see I have two. So I have name right? Actually, no, sorry. I have three. So I have name here, and this is going to be logging into the GitHub container registry. Just a little information about that. The container registry is it's a centralized repository for storing these containers. So remember that container is just that virtual machine, that lightweight virtual machine, that environment for everything we need for performing that regression analysis on the biological data, right? So we want to perform the analysis on the data. We need to create or set up our environment. We have a prepackaged environment for that. And so we also want to store it for our own documentation purposes and maybe making it publicly accessible to others. So we want to upload it to a container registry. Well, GitHub Actions will automatically do that for us. Well, one thing we have to do is we have to log into the GitHub container registry before we can update the image and then push it or send it to the container registry. How do we do that? Well, I'm going to import an action. So I'm going to take advantage of a GitHub action that was already written and defined by somebody else. So I'm going to call it logging into container registry. You can pretty much name it whatever you want here. And then because I'm using a pre-built open source action, I'm going to use this uses argument. So uses, and then you can see I specify the name of the open source action. You can find this on GitHub Marketplace. I'll put that in the chat shortly. We're actually running out of time. I'm sorry. I was hoping to get through more. But you find that the name of the specific action, you look at the documentation, see what arguments or pieces it requires. So we're gonna say, okay, this is the action I want. It's already pre-built. It already performs this task of logging into the GitHub container registry for me. But what do I need to give it so it can do that? Well, then I need to give it these arguments. So then I use that with key, right? As shown in the slide previously. I use with, and then with what information? Well, this comes from the documentation for this specific action from the GitHub Marketplace. We're going to give it the registry I want it to log into, right? There's different container registries. There's Docker Hub, there's GitHub Container Registry, and I'm sure there's more. We were using Docker Hub. We switched to GitHub Container Registry because it's free. I think Docker Hub changed their business model. They'll be charging soon. So we're getting away from that. So I say, okay, I want to use the GitHub Container Registry that goes by ghcr.io. So that's the registry I want to give it. And then it's going to need your credentials to log into that container registry, right? So you need to give this action your GitHub username, and then your GitHub password, which is your personal access token. Now, we don't want this information stored and visible directly on our repository, right? Especially if it's public, but even if it's private, right? That's a security risk. So GitHub has something known as secrets. I don't think I have time to go through them now. I'm going to fly through the rest of this YAML because I just want to go through all the GitHub actions steps. But you can set up GitHub secrets, and so it can import these secrets into your workflow YAML file in such a way that they become available to your GitHub workflow, but they're not visible to anyone viewing your YAML file or your workflow information, right? So then I give it my GitHub username, my GitHub personal access token, right? And once I specified all these, this first task is just going to log right into that GitHub container registry, right? And when I run this workflow, when this workflow gets triggered, you'll see that in the live logs. It'll say logging in. And then if everything's successful, you'll see that and there's no errors, right? And then I'm going to import another GitHub actions, right? So this one's called actions/checkout at v2. That's just version 2. This checkout action is really useful because it basically makes everything available in the repo that you're working with. It makes it available to the runner, right? So this runner or this virtual machine. Oh, sorry.
Why is users on line 14 at a different level of nesting than users on line 19?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you quite clearly. I'm sorry, Paul.
Why is the users on line 14 at a different level of nesting than users on line 19?
I think they're on the same level, like in terms of being lined up, but this is. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
Oh, do you mean though why this one kind of stands alone versus this one's subsumed under this name piece here?
Exactly. Yeah.
Got you. That's because these are two different steps, and I named this step, and I didn't name this step, But this, so when you have this hyphen before it, it's kind of its own like separate step from this. So these are two separate steps, but this one has a name, so it's subsumed under that name. So
Okay,
this
thank
one,
you.
yeah, no worries. I couldn't name this one, but this is kind of the checkout action is it's kind of like a really, you know, commonly used action that just like, okay, just make everything in the repo available to my virtual machine, to my runner. Because just an important note, I'm glad you asked that, Paul. An important note, when you specify, you know, your runner and you set up a GitHub Actions workflow, in the beginning, I've made the mistake of assuming that, okay, well, I got my GitHub Actions workflow on this repo, and this workflow is going to affect things on this repo. It's automatically going to have all the contents of this repo that the workflow is on available and accessible to it. But that's not the case. If you run, you know, this workflow and you don't use this imported action or some action or some code to kind of make all the contents of a repo available to the runner, it won't be able to detect or find things that you want to operate on if you're operating on any of the content in this repo or any other repo. It's kind of like, yeah, just that isolated environment. If you don't make anything accessible to it, it won't have those things to operate on. So this is pretty important. You'll find yourself using this imported GitHub Actions or some you know variant of it quite often. So yeah, I log into, you know, the GitHub container registry in this step, and it uses this action. I then check out everything from the repo to make it available in my runner with this imported GitHub action. So there are two different GitHub actions, as kindly pointed out by Paul. And then I have a third step. This third step, as you can see, doesn't use an imported GitHub action. It runs just code that I wrote. So that's why I think this is a nice example, because you can see, okay, we use two pre-built open source actions, and then we also use a step, a job, or a task that kind of just uses our own custom code. And so I create a name for this, and this is called, you know, check Docker file and update image. I give it an ID, right? That way I can access anything related to this step. And then just like as shown in the slide, I have this run key or this run argument. So it's run colon, and then you have the pipe operator, because you can see I have a whole bunch of lines of code, right? And so it's just shell scripting at that point, because remember, we're using Ubuntu, right? So we're using Linux as our operating system. So our runner has that. And so now we're just, you know, coding as if we're right on, you know, the terminal of, you know, any Linux operating system. And so, you know, I changed directories. I got this big, you know, if conditional, and then it ends. I would go through it more, but we're out of time. But that's the gist of it. So you can see kind of like as shown on the slide, you got these key pieces, the name, right? Just naming your workflow, the on. And so, you know, the on kind of trickles down to break down exactly what is the triggering event, you know, where things need to occur to trigger the workflow. And then you have the jobs piece, and the jobs piece specifies that runner, right? That virtual machine or that server, in the steps that are going to take place, right? The jobs are the tasks that are going to take place on that runner. And then you can specify kind of those steps using already pre-built GitHub actions that are open source on publicly available repos, or you can write your own code as seen in this third step here. Sorry, I should have made it a little shorter, but I just wanted to give an intro to GitHub Actions before we dive into this. But any questions or anything that wasn't clear? Hopefully I can do a part 2 where we can.
Hey, Jordan, I'm just cutting in to ask questions. Thanks by the way for the presentation. My very simple question is, how does like containerization fall into like the walkthrough that you just did? Was very helpful. Like you show like how it's like the whole workflow runs on Ubuntu latest, right? And then your step one, then you like have the GitHub action from the marketplace. So I'm curious, like, you know, how at the very end, your last step, you have like the Docker build and all that stuff. So I'm just curious, like, is that all being inherited from that Docker / login action? Just trying to see where, like, you know, let's say you're building a, like, you know, a new CI job and you want to like, you know, utilize some kind of image, right? Obviously, you don't want to do like apt-get install, pip install every time. Just curious where all that stuff comes in, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the reason we're logging into the container registry is because if we do want to update the image, then we want to tag it and push it and upload it to this container registry. So you'll see that we log in first, and then we check everything out of the repo, and we do that specifically so we can actually check the Docker file. So we're not pulling any container, but we are checking the Docker file for updates. So you can see in the repo, we do CD metadata. And then in the repo, in the README, we'll say, okay, the repository has the following structure, and here's the folders. And then in the metadata folder, that's where you want to store things such as your Docker file. So if we make a change, so if we upload a Docker file or we edit the Docker file within this folder, that's when, as you'll see in our workflow, this will be triggered, and then it'll look for that change, right? It'll look for that change specifically here. It'll create a new tag, right? And then what it's going to do is it's going to build that new version of the image from that Docker file using Docker build, right? Because we already entered into the metadata folder. We're going to build that new image from the changed Docker file, the newly edited Docker file. We're going to assign it that new Docker name that we created, right? Right here, right? And then we're going to tag it with the new tag. And then this is where we use this previous step here for storing the container. This is where the container stuff comes in. Now, after the tag, we're going to push this new container to the GitHub container registry using the latest Docker name and tag, right? And then we kind of restructure things from there, right? We do some adds, we do some commits, we do a git add, a git commit, just to update the repo also. That's why we also did the checkout step, to make everything in the repo accessible to the runner. So now after we say, hey, there's been a change in the Docker file, let's build a new image, right, based on this new Docker file, and then let's name and tag the image, let's update that, and then push it to the container registry. So that's why we log in here. And then once that's pushed to the container registry, so now we have a new version of the image that's ready for people to pull and download and easily use. Then also let's update the repo. So then we're going to log in to, GitHub. We're going to make a new directory if it doesn't exist, Docker builds, and that's going to be right in the metadata. And that's going to store, the Docker builds, the Docker files. And so then we move that new, that newly edited or recently edited Docker file to where we want it. We write, into that Docker file, basically saying, hey, we're going to use this new latest image as our base image. So now it updates the Docker file stored on the repo. It's going to add, commit, and push. And that's why it's important we make this push only happen when there's been a change to the metadata Docker file. This additional piece is really important, because if this wasn't here and the triggering event was just any push to main, then you can see we might actually trigger the workflow over and over again, because we are making a push to main. We update main by committing a new Docker file, but the Docker file hasn't been edited.
Okay, thanks, Jordan. Yeah, that was a lot of details, but I followed you. My last very quick question is, correct me if I'm wrong, but so like if you want to use GitHub Action as a CI tool, there's no way to like trigger an action manually, right? It always has to be some kind of GitHub quote unquote trigger, right? Like you either have to like modify a file or do something. You can't just like go into the action tab and like actually like press play or something.
Well, I want to say that you can trigger one manually, but I guess how do you mean manually? Because you could go onto the repo and use the web interface and I guess
okay, yeah, it's like literally I think you have all the actions right in like a tab, and then you can like, I think there's a way. There's like usually a play button, not a play button, but like you can see the spinner running right whenever it's being triggered. But I'm just curious, there's a way you can like just say build now or like run this action. So it sounds like you're saying that you can trigger things beyond that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can. So I haven't done that in a while, but I'm pretty sure, and I could look into that and get back to you, but I'm pretty sure there's a way to just trigger and run the workflow without waiting on that specific triggering event, just to test it. I'm almost positive there's a way. So I want to say yes to that. And just on and that's a great question. Any other questions, Paul? Sorry. And just on a final note, kind of like, the final product or the end result of that GitHub actions would be, okay, so we're updating the image, the container image. We're making it available on the repo in the Docker file instructions, but we're also making it available in this container registry here. So then you can see, under packages, under your organization or your repo, you'll have this GitHub container registry, these packages that can be publicly available, and you can access them, by doing something as simple as copying this and typing it into your terminal, because now it's publicly available for download. So the GitHub action will tag it and push it, and also keep track of all the tagged images here. So it'll kind of update all that information, make new updated container images for running analyses in publicly available, so you can pull them, download them, and so you have that process of kind of continuous integration, continuous deployment there. Sorry, I know I'm over time. I'm sorry, everybody. Any other questions? Oh, I think everyone left. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you.